What's that? No, I'm busy. Um, yes. Good afternoon. Let's talk a little bit more about um, Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing. So, in Odell 2, she asked the question: what happens to our minds? What happens to our selves? What happens to our sense of worth when we have to slow down? When, for whatever reason, we are in quarantine or we have become overwhelmed by the demands that we've placed on ourselves or that others have placed on us, or some combination of the two. And I'm not talking about some sort of massive mental health breakdown here. I'm just talking about normal, everyday life, right? With a burden that becomes too heavy to bear. And it's time to lay down the sword and shield, right? And do something else. So, what happens to life? That's what she wants to know, right? And so, again, this comes back to this concept of what does she mean by how to do nothing? And we're still not there. We still haven't fully wrapped our arms around this thing yet, right? So, there is a place nearby where Jenny Odell works. It's a rose garden. You know, stop and smell the roses, right? We've all been told to do this at different times. It's a cliche, it's a hackneyed, banal expression. But rose gardens are, in fact, really beautiful places, and there's an old tradition dating back centuries of creating a garden just for roses, right? So this is where she goes to be at peace, in a way, to do nothing, but to do nothing in a particular kind of valuable sense, right? A sort of a nourishing sense. So, you know, the question is, does it count to do nothing if you are just kind of binging on Netflix, right? Or just sort of in some way distracting yourself. And again, the answer might be no, you're filling an empty space with an entertainment product that on some level you're paying for, right? And this is exactly what she's saying. Try to figure out how not to do this. So, a rose garden, a vacant lot, these other places, that this is again related to this concept of subtraction, right? Take away something, especially in a city, right, which can be so dense and packed with information and people and buildings and various kinds of architectural statements that it becomes overwhelming, like a sea of references that it's easy to become lost in so you don't even notice it, right? But what if you open up a space and don't fill it with anything, right? Both inside your mind, in your personal life, but also architecturally speaking, right? Do you, in a sense, acknowledge the importance of nothingness by leaving something empty? Do you give people an opportunity to explore empty space inside themselves when you provide them an empty space within which to sit and contemplate the sense of being and its connection to the universe? Absolutely, right? And so, what about um, these kinds of public goods that we were talking about in reference to an earlier work? You know, things like staring out the window as the rain falls on a bus on your way home, right? And this time, not putting your earbuds in or reading your phone or whatever it might be, but just allowing the emptiness of this to happen, right? So, public spaces and public goods often are fertile areas for the importance of nothingness to emanate from, right? And so, again, they require a kind of care and maintenance that encourages a different sort of behavior than that dedicated to productivity. So, and this dates back to Aristotle and before, the concept of an ethics based around maintenance and care, right? As opposed to regulating production, that is to say, what should I do today in order to be productive? I'm going to get out of bed, jump out of bed, and run to work, right? And be a good worker, right? But that can have a certain ethical content to it, that action, right? But so can, right? I'm going to carefully nurture this little corner of my balcony garden, right? Throughout the entire spring, right? Or as a group, we collectively are going to pay for, hire, and train people to prune our rose gardens, right? So and this is both metaphoric and real, right? So that is to say that Odell is arguing that sometimes our emphasis on productivity leads us to reject or ignore an ethics of care and maintenance. That is, we no longer pay as close attention to the value of maintaining and carrying things over time, which takes a lot of focus and work, but it's a different kind of focus and work, right? You're not throwing yourself madly into this effort and trying to raise a building. You're carefully kind of managing the lives of different growing things. Often we compare this to a garden, but it doesn't have to be only a garden, right? You can maintain a building, you can maintain other creatures, brushing a beloved pet, right? Making sure that they eat well. These are all related to this idea that there is an ethics of care and maintenance, that the emphasis on productivity and moment to moment performance-like measurements cause this ethics of care and maintenance to be lost or to be obscured, right? Now, one of the things that we have talked about, but which we must return to, right, is the practice of doing nothing, right? That is to say, what does it involve? And again, we must think very carefully about this, right? Because Odell is asking us to train our minds and our senses to be sharper, to have better perceptual capacity, right? That is to open up the bandwidth, both of sight, of hearing, of touch, of all these different things, and including understanding, right? So that if we focus on this, then our perceptual capacity increases, right? And it makes doing nothing a much different experience, right? So her point here is that if you just lie on the couch and stare at the ceiling and you are just like kind of exhausted, right? That's maybe kind of more what we casually think about when we think about nothing. But what if you were to lie on the couch, close your eyes, and try to listen to every tiny sound, right, that you can hear outside your apartment or wherever it is that you live, right? And try to pick up on it, notice it, and try to identify it. That would be a completely different activity. And again, almost impossible to overstate how different those two activities are. Even though we call them both sort of doing nothing, right? In fact, they're wildly divergent from one another. So this is what she calls deep listening, right? And it's possible to deep listen to many things, music included. But I think Odell is not talking about just like, popping in your earbuds and just like, listening to whatever's on your playlist, right? Like this is a focused exercise. So while a music can play a role here, a lot of times what we're talking about is listening to background sounds that we don't normally notice, right? The idea here is in doing nothing, you're not distracting yourself. You're in fact using this perceptual apparatus to more fully, tentacularly engage with your surroundings. So, on the one hand, doing nothing is weird, right? You're not producing anything. Some people might say you're wasting your time, perhaps even, right? Because you aren't like furthering your goals while you're doing it, right? And so this can be almost a little bit nerve-wracking or terrifying. But Odell says that you discover sometimes new things through the process of doing nothing, that you might learn something about the people close by you, right? As you kind of open up space to allow new items to emerge, new aspects of your surrounding reality, right? In Odell's case, she learned something new about her mom that she never knew after years of closeness. So another thing that she brings up that's interesting is that this concept of doing nothing as it relates to nature, right, is an old idea. It's not something that she is like, offering as some sort of like new and radical kind of concept. And she goes back to when unions became particularly active, right, in the 19th century, in terms of advocating for, protesting for, sometimes violently being repressed for trying to get better working hours, right? During this time period, the Western world became rapidly industrialized, and massive numbers of both men and women entered the industrialized workforce. And originally there was no weekends, right? And hours, in terms of what working hours were set by the employer, right? It was basically whatever he, and it was mostly he, thought he could sort of get away with in terms of extracting as much labor as he could, right? So unions arose and fought back and organized and struck, meaning they did not go to work. And there was a long process of conflict resolution that gave rise to the environment that we live in today, where there is limits on the amount of work that you can do during a week, right? Placed upon your employer by law, right? And this is connected to the adoption of a rights-based standard, that is a human rights-based standard, weekends, etc. But to go back to her original point, the idea here was that, what were the rest of the day for? If an 8-hour workday was the limit of what workers argued they should be susceptible to, then that left 8 hours for sleep and 8 hours for other stuff, right? And some of this could be like, hanging out with your family, doing projects around your house, right? But other things that they identified were rest, thinking, right? Enjoying the beauty of flowers, that is to say, just appreciating your surroundings. Flowers being kind of a metaphor, once again, going back to the rose garden, for this just capacity to look and take pleasure in what immediately surrounds you. And, sunshine. Now, this might sound trivial to you, but it's true that when workers were advocating for a regulated workday, right, what they spoke of and what they placed in their literature and in some of the songs that they sang in order to motivate themselves while they were striking on the picket lines were precisely those things, right? So Odell's point here is that the desire to do nothing, and by doing nothing, that means to sort of appreciate life without being guided, without having your attention purchased or controlled, right? But just to use your natural biological perceptual apparatus to engage with and appreciate your life and your immediate surroundings, that this was known to be very important to human beings, that this was understood on an intuitive level or an unconscious level to be crucial to the development of the maintenance of not just happiness, but also fulfillment, of meaning, right, of healthy relationships with others. And so much so that it was actually encoded in the documents that the workers used when they were, literally risking their lives to try to gain a more enforced workday.